The word marriage reached Lynette Hale through a keyhole, which was, she would later think, exactly how the truth generally chose to arrive in that house, sideways, unannounced, and too late to refuse. She had knelt to retrieve a dropped spool of thread outside her aunt's parlour, when she heard her own name spoken in the flat, satisfied tone people used for accounts already settled. She did not yet know that the man she was to marry had not spoken a single word in 3 years, or that his silence would teach her more of him than any man's conversation ever had. She knew only that her aunt, Mrs. Beatrice Fenn, was telling a visitor with a voice like poured honey that the girl would do very well, that the girl had no family left to make trouble, and that the girl, being plain and grateful and clever with figures, would ask no questions she was not paid to ask. Lynette did not move. She had learned stillness the way other girls learnt dancing, as a survival skill practised until it looked like grace, and she used it now, kneeling on the cold flags with the thread forgotten in her palm, listening to a gentleman called Mr. Vane describe her future as though he were pricing a mare. He had a voice built for comfort, warm at the edges, and it was that warmth, more than any threat, that told her to be afraid. Her father had taught her that. Thomas Hale had kept the books for the Ashcombe estate for 11 years before he was turned out for refusing to make a false ledger balance true, and he had died 3 winters later in 2 rented rooms, still murmuring about columns that would not add, and the last useful thing he had given his daughter, besides an eye for a doctored figure, was the knowledge that the gentlest voices in any room were the ones most likely to be lying. She rose only when she heard her aunt's chair scrape back, and she was in the hall, polishing a candlestick that did not need it when the parlour door opened, and Julian Vane came out, adjusting a signet ring on his smallest finger, smiling at her with a warmth that did not reach as far as his eyes. "Miss Hale," he said, "I understand congratulations are in order, though no one has yet troubled to congratulate you." She said that she was glad to hear there was cause. He laughed, a pleasant sound, and told her that a girl with her composure would make a very fine duchess indeed. And then he was gone, and her aunt was calling her in, and the thing was already settled the way the letter calling her ruin a mercy is always already sealed by the time anyone troubles to read it aloud to the person it is about. Her aunt did not raise her eyes from her needlework. "You are to marry the Duke of Mirrorfield," she said. "Cassian Thorn. You will be married within the fortnight, and you will be grateful, because I have done for you what your own poor dead father could never manage, which is to make you worth something." Lynette asked, quietly, why a duke would want a wife with no name and no money, and her aunt's needle did not pause. "Because he cannot ask for one himself. He does not speak. He has not spoken one word since his father died, 3 years gone, and half the county believes he is mad, and the other half believes worse, and his mother is desperate enough now to take a girl who will not mind the silence because she is used to being unheard. It is Michaelmas, or the whole estate passes from him by the old Duke's will, to a cousin, and Mr. Vane has been very kind in arranging matters quickly." 6 weeks, Lynette thought, and did the sum without meaning to, the way she summed everything. 6 weeks between herself and a stranger's house, and a silence she could not yet imagine. She asked what manner of man he was, beneath the silence, and her aunt said she neither knew nor cared, and that neither should Lynette, since duchesses were not paid to have opinions. That night Lynette sat by her narrow window with her father's old ledger open on her knees, the one habit she had never surrendered, and ran her thumb down a column of numbers that meant nothing any more, only to feel something orderly under her hand while the rest of her life rearranged itself without her consent. She did not weep. She had given that up years ago as an expense she could not afford. She thought instead, with the dry clarity that was the only inheritance her father had left her outright, that a man who had chosen silence for 3 years must have had a reason large enough to be worth the cost, and that reasons, unlike rumours, could generally be found if one was patient and looked at the right ledger. She did not know yet that she would be right. She only knew that in 6 weeks she would stand up in a strange chapel beside a man the whole county called mute, and that whatever waited for her there, she intended to meet it with her eyes open, because a woman who had spent her whole life being looked past had at least learned how to look very, very carefully back. The carriage that came for her 11 days later was black and unmarked, and the coachman would not meet her eyes, and as it pulled away from the only house that had ever grudgingly sheltered her, she pressed her hand flat against the cold glass and thought, with the strange calm of a person crossing a bridge she cannot see the end of, that whatever else was true of the silent Duke of Mirrorfield, he had just become the only sum in her life she had not yet learned how to solve. Mirrorfield announced itself first by its birds. Linnet heard them before she saw the house, a riot of small song pouring from somewhere behind high walls, and she thought it a strange sound for a house so widely called cursed. The Dowager Duchess received her in a long room hung with portraits of Thornes, who all seemed to share the same grave mouth, and Constance Thorne turned out to be a thin, upright woman, whose hands trembled very slightly, and whose eyes assessed Linnet with the particular hunger of a mother running out of time. "You will forgive me for not rising," the Duchess said. "My health is not what it was, and neither, I think, is my patience for pretending this is an ordinary courtship." She said it plainly, and Linnet found she liked her for it, the way one likes any person who declines to lie about the weather while standing in the rain. It was Hetty Marsh, the housekeeper, dry as good paper, who took Lynette up the stairs afterward and told her the rules of the house in the voice of a woman reciting a recipe she disapproved of, but intended to follow anyway. "His Grace does not speak," Hetty said. "He writes what he must, and points at what he cannot be troubled to write, and if you go about flinching every time he looks at you, you will not last the winter, and I have buried enough hope in this house without burying yours as well." Linnet asked whether the Duke was unkind. Hetty's hands, folding linen, did not pause. "He has never once been unkind, in 3 years of having every reason in this world to be." "That is not nothing, Miss Hale. Remember I said so." She met him for the first time in the long gallery, where he stood with his back to a window, so that for a moment he was only a shape cut out of the light, tall and still in a way that had nothing of nervousness in it, and everything of a man who had learned to hold himself like a closed door. He did not come toward her. He inclined his head, the smallest possible courtesy, and drew a small worn notebook from his coat, and wrote in a hand as controlled as his silence, and turned it toward her. "I am told you keep excellent accounts," it read. "I have need of someone who can read a ledger better than I can read a room." Lynette looked up at him, at the grey eyes that gave away exactly nothing, and yet did not look away from her either, and she said that she supposed a duchess was expected to say something gracious in return, and that she had never been very good at gracious. But she was excellent with figures, and if he required an honest ledger she would give him one, whatever else passed between them or did not. Something moved behind his eyes, so briefly she nearly missed it, gone before she could name it. He wrote again. "Then we are already in agreement on more than most married people manage by their wedding night," it said, and something in the dry economy of it told her that whatever silence had cost this man, it had not cost him his mind, and it had certainly not cost him his wit, and she found. standing in that long, cold gallery with a stranger who could not speak to her, that she was no longer quite so afraid of the 6 weeks ahead as she had been of the 6 weeks behind her. The wedding itself was small, hurried, and Lynette thought, entirely without warmth, conducted 3 days before the deadline, in a chapel full of witnesses who had come to see a curiosity rather than a marriage. Julian Vane stood near the front throughout, smiling the smile of a man who had arranged everything and intended to be thanked for it, and it was he, not the groom, who spoke the loudest congratulations afterward, his hand lingering half a moment too long on Lynette's wrist, as he wished her every happiness a silent house could hold. She noted it the way she noted everything now, filed and set aside. The household had its own quiet commentary on the match. She overheard 2 footmen debating, in the particular hushed glee of servants who believed themselves unheard, whether the new Duchess would last a month before she too gave up trying to make him talk. And there was, she gathered, an actual wagering book kept below stairs on the date, if any, that His Grace would first be heard to speak in his new wife's presence. She found she did not resent it. A house that could still make jokes about its own grief was a house not yet entirely lost. It was on the 2nd night after the ceremony, not the 1st, that the wedding night the county would talk of for a year finally came, because on the 1st night Cassian had bowed at her door and gone, leaving her alone with her borrowed room and her father's ledger for company, and she had told herself she was relieved. On the 2nd night she was reading by a single candle when the door opened without a knock, which frightened her more than anything he had yet done, because it was the first ungoverned thing she had seen him do. His face was wrong, tight around the eyes, and his hand, when it closed over her wrist, was not gentle. She had half risen, her pulse loud in her own ears, certain in that instant that every warning her aunt had refused to give her was about to be proven true, when he said, in a voice rusted from 3 years of disuse, rough and low and entirely unlike the careful hand that wrote his notes, 2 words that would follow her the rest of her life. "You're mine," he said. Not a question. Not tender. A man dragging something up from very deep water and finding it heavier than he remembered. Lynette did not scream, and she did not weep, and she did not, though every instinct told her to, pull away. She only stood very still, the way her father had taught her, and said, when she trusted her own voice again, that she was no one's, and that whatever had frightened him enough to break 3 years of silence, he had best tell her plainly, because she did not intend to be claimed by a man who could not yet bring himself to explain why. He let go of her at once, as though her stillness had woken him from something, and for a long moment he only stood there, breathing hard, a man visibly appalled at his own hands. Then he found the notebook, his fingers clumsy with whatever had just torn through him, and wrote with a pressure that nearly split the page. "Forgive me. I heard Vane below in the passage tonight, speaking of you as though you were an asset already spent. I have watched one house destroyed by what men like that say quietly in passages, and I could not bear to hear it a second time and say nothing." Lynette read it twice before she looked up at him. "Then say something," she told him. "Say it properly, not with your hand around my wrist like a man drowning." He wrote for a long moment, crossed it out, and finally only turned the notebook toward her with 4 words on it. "There is a reason. Beneath it, smaller, I will tell you when it costs less." She studied him, this large, silent stranger with his father's grave mouth and his mother's frightened eyes, and she thought of her own father's ledgers, of how a column that would not balance always meant a figure hidden somewhere upstream, and she said, evenly, that she was very good at waiting for a sum to resolve itself, having done nothing else her whole life, but that she would not be handled like a frightened horse in her own bedchamber again, not even by a duke, and certainly not by a husband. Something that was almost a smile crossed his face, gone as quickly as it came, and he wrote one line more before he left her that night. "Silence is not the same as absence," it said, and underneath, in a hand grown suddenly less steady, he had added only, "I am sorry it looked like a threat. It was meant as a vow." She sat a long while after the door closed, turning the phrase over the way she turned over doubtful figures, "Silence is not the same as absence," and found, to her own surprise, that she believed it, and that belief, offered so cheaply to a man she barely knew, frightened her far more than his hand around her wrist ever had. The house settled into its false peace the way houses do, days folding quietly into one another while the real business of the story went on underneath, unseen. Linnet took up the estate books within the week, at Cassian's written request, and over Julian Vane's smiling objection that a bride ought to be resting rather than labouring over accounts that had been very ably kept for 3 years. Already by himself. She found, in fact, that the books were kept beautifully, every column true, every sum accounted, which told her precisely nothing and everything at once, because a man clever enough to falsify a ledger was always clever enough to keep the rest of it honest. She and Cassian fell into a working rhythm that surprised them both. Mornings spent at the long table in the estate office, his notebook between them, her quill moving through the tenant rolls while he read over her shoulder, and corrected her only twice in a fortnight, both times rightly. She learned his gestures the way one learns a foreign alphabet, out of necessity first, and then out of something warmer. 2 taps of his knuckle on the table meant agreement. A closed fist pressed briefly against his sternum meant a thing he could not yet say. He pressed 2 fingers to the base of his own throat when a word threatened to come, and did not. A habit so private she suspected he did not know he did it. Once, reading a tenant's absurdly misspelled petition aloud in the dry voice she used for anything she found ridiculous, she looked up to find his shoulders shaking with silent laughter, his hand over his mouth, as though the sound itself might cost him something he was not ready to spend, and Hetty Marsh, passing the open door with an armful of linen, stopped dead in the passage, and said, to no one in particular, that she had not seen the master's shoulders do that since before his father died, and that someone had better write it in a book somewhere, because miracles ought to be recorded. Linnet asked her later what had happened 3 years ago, and Hetty's face closed like a shutter. "That is not mine to give you," she said. "It is his. But I will tell you this much for nothing, Miss Hale. Whatever he is guarding with that silence of his, he has guarded it at his own expense every single day for 3 years, and a man does not pay that dearly to hide a sin. He pays that dearly to hide a wound." Linnet filed it away with everything else, and went back to the ledgers, and told herself she was patient, and did not entirely believe it, because the closer she came to liking the silence of this strange grave man, the more urgently she wanted to know what it was costing him to keep it. Julian Vane, meanwhile, was making himself agreeable in the particular way of a man who intends eventually to be believed over everyone else in the room. He called at Merrifield with wine and with compliments, admired the new Duchess's diligence over the books with a warmth that never once reached his eyes, and told her, more than once, in the gentlest possible voice, that he only worried for her, married as she was to a man so changed by grief that no one could truly say what he was capable of. "He is not dangerous," Lynette said, the first time Julian offered this concern, and Julian smiled and said, "Of course not. Of course not. Only that grief did strange things to a man's mind, and that his own poor uncle had gone the same way before the end, silent and staring, and had done things afterward that the family did not speak of." Lynette asked what things. "Best not dwelt on, Duchess," Julian said, and turned the conversation to the excellent weather. And it was only after he had gone that Lynette realised his hands had been perfectly steady throughout, and that a man telling the truth about an old family sorrow does not usually need such very steady hands to tell it. She found the first true thread not in a conversation, but in a column of figures, 3 weeks into her marriage, going back through the household medicine accounts at Cassian's request, since the dowager's health required careful tracking of her tonics. Buried among entries in Julian's own careful steward's hand, she found an old order to the local apothecary. A Mr. Culpepper for foxglove tincture, dated some months before the old Duke's death, and beside it, in a different, hastier hand she did not recognise, a note increasing the dosage twice within a single fortnight. She thought nothing of it beyond a bookkeeper's idle itch at handwriting that did not match its neighbours, and set it aside in the corner of her mind where she kept every figure that would not yet balance. Not knowing that she had just laid her hand, quite by accident, on the one thread that would eventually unravel the whole silent house around her, it was the Duchess Constance who gave her the next piece, in the slow, careful way of a woman handing over something she had been afraid to hold too long herself. She summoned Lynette to her rooms one grey afternoon, and spoke of her late husband with a tenderness that made the silence of the house feel suddenly much larger. He was not an easy man, but he loved his son, and his heart failed him slowly, over months, though the physician always swore it need not have failed so fast. I gave him his tonic every night myself, with my own hand, because I did not trust it to a maid, and I have wondered every night since whether I gave him too much, whether my own hand killed him, and I have never once had the courage to ask anyone to look at the accounts and tell me the truth, because I was afraid of what the truth would be. Lynette asked, gently, whether Cassian had ever spoken to her of that night, before his silence began. The Duchess's hands twisted in her lap. He came in an hour after his father died, white as a sheet, and he looked at me the way you look at someone you love and fear in the same breath, and he has not said one full sentence to me since, though he writes to me kindly enough, and visits me every day, and I have told myself for 3 years that his silence is grief for his father, and nothing more. Because the other thought is unbearable. Lynette sat very still, feeling the shape of something terrible assembling itself just beyond her reach, and she thought of the hasty hand beside Julian's neat one in the medicine ledger, and she thought of Cassian's fist pressed to his own chest when a thing could not yet be said, and she understood, with the cold clarity of a sum finally resolving, that whatever Cassian Thorne had seen or heard the night his father died, it had frightened him not into guilt, but into guarding someone he loved from a truth he could not yet prove, and that the someone he was guarding was very likely the trembling woman sitting across from her now. She did not say so. She only took the Duchess's hand and told her that grief made cowards of the bravest people, and that she did not believe for one moment that a woman who wept this openly over a possible wrong had ever been capable of doing it on purpose. And the Duchess wept harder at that, and Lynette held her hand and thought, beneath her own composure, that she had just found the shape of the trap Cassian had spent 3 years standing silently inside of, and that she would need proof. Real proof. Ink and figures, and a witness who would crack, before she dared to try to pull him out. The blow, when it came from the last direction Lynette expected, which was to say it came dressed as kindness. Julian called again, alone this time, finding her in the estate office over the tenant rolls, and he was gentler than she had ever seen him, almost sorrowful, and he told her that he had come to say something difficult because he thought she deserved to hear it from a friend rather than from gossip. There is a rumour travelling the county that the old Duke's death was not so natural as everyone believed, and that certain figures in the household accounts, in a hand very like the current Duke's own, show an increase in his father's medicine shortly before he died. He let that sit a moment, his face arranged into reluctant grief. And then he said the thing that was meant to break her. "I have always wondered, Duchess, whether that is why he stopped speaking. Guilt does that to a man, they say, more surely than sorrow ever could." Lynette felt the floor of her certainty tilt under her, because she had seen that hasty hand herself in the ledger, and had not yet been able to place it as anyone's, and for one terrible moment she allowed herself to wonder whether the silence she had begun, God help her, to love, was not a wound at all, but a wall built around a sin. She said nothing of this to Julian. She thanked him for his honesty in a voice that gave away nothing, and watched him go, and sat afterward with the ledger open before her, staring at the hasty increase in the foxglove dosage until the letters swam, trying and failing to convince herself that a hand under strain does not always look like its owner's true hand, that a forger's whole art is looking like someone else, and that a man who pressed his fist to his chest rather than speak a hard truth was not thereby proven a murderer. She almost believed herself. And then, turning to compare the hasty hand once more against samples of Cassian's own careful, deliberate script from his notebooks, she noticed for the first time, with a jolt that went through her like cold water, that the two hands, laid side by side, did not match at all, not in the shape of the numerals, not in the slant, not in the way the letter S curled back on itself, which meant someone had gone to considerable trouble to make a rumour of a resemblance that did not, in fact, exist on the page, and that whoever had started that rumour in the county had either never looked closely at the evidence, or had looked very closely indeed, and counted on nobody else ever doing the same. That night she went to Cassian and laid the ledger open between them without a word, and pointed to the hasty entry, and to his own hand beside it, and asked him plainly aloud whether he had increased his father's dosage. He went very white, and for a long moment his hand hovered over the notebook and did not move, and Lynette understood, watching him, that she had just asked the one question he had built 3 years of silence around not answering. He wrote at last, slowly, as though every word were being paid for out of some account nearly exhausted. "I did not write that entry. I have never seen that hand before tonight, though I have wondered for 3 years whose it was. I came into my father's room an hour before he died, and heard Vane through the door promising Culpepper money for his trouble, and telling him the dose could not be traced. I did not understand what I had heard until my father was already dying in my mother's arms, her own hand having given him the draught that killed him, following an order she believed the physician's own. I could not prove what I had heard. I could not accuse a man everyone loved with nothing but my own ears as witness, and if I spoke and was wrong, or spoke and could not prove it, my mother would go to her grave believing her own hand a murderer's, or worse, the county would come to believe it too. So I said nothing, to anyone, about anything, because I did not trust myself to open my mouth and keep the accusation inside it. Linnet read this through twice, her own hands not quite steady now, and when she looked up at him his eyes were wet in a way she had not yet seen, and she understood, all at once, the full shape and cost of 3 years of silence, that it had never been guilt at all, but a man standing guard, alone, over the one truth that could destroy the person he loved most, waiting with a patience that had nearly destroyed him instead, for proof he had not known how to find. She told him, quietly, that he was a fool to have carried it alone so long, and that he was not carrying it alone any longer, because she had spent her whole life reading figures other people missed, and she did not intend to stop now that the sum finally mattered. He reached for her hand then, gently this time, nothing at all like the wedding night, and wrote only, "You believe me," not a question. She said aloud that she did, entirely, and that belief, once given so completely to a man who had waited 3 years to be believed, undid something in him that neither of them had words enough, spoken or written, to name. Julian Vane noticed the shift before he understood its cause, the way a careful man always senses the temperature of a room changing before he can name the draught. He called less often after that, and when he called he watched Linnet with a new wariness beneath the warmth, and it was he, in the end, who overreached, offering her one evening, with every appearance of concern for her welfare. A settlement and safe passage back to her aunt's house, if she would only sign a statement testifying that his Grace's silence had of late grown violent and unpredictable. A statement, he said gently, that would spare everyone a great deal of scandal and secure her own comfortable independence besides. Lynette looked at the paper he laid before her, already drafted in a clerk's careful hand, and she thought of her father, dismissed and ruined for refusing to make one false ledger balance, dying still murmuring about columns that would not add, and she picked up the pen Julian had thoughtfully provided, and used it instead to draw one clean line through the false statement from corner to corner. The way she squared every account she did not intend to let stand. "I have no gift for signing lies, Mr. Vane, whatever they are made to cost me." Julian's smile did not falter, but something behind it did, and he told her almost kindly that a woman with no name and no fortune could not afford so many principles, and Linnet said that a woman with no name and no fortune was, in her experience, the only sort who ever discovered what her principles were actually worth, since she had nothing else left to spend. He left without his paper, and within the week word reached the house, carried by Hetty Marsh with her mouth pressed into a thin, furious line, that a whisper was travelling the county of a new duchess, grown so unstable in her grief-mad husband's house that she had begun refusing to cooperate with those who wished only to help her, and Lynette understood, hearing it, that Julian had simply moved the attack from her hand to her reputation, and that the net was closing now, not around Cassian alone, but around them both. The blackest night came a week later, and it began with a locked door. Linnet returned from the tenant cottages at dusk to find her own belongings moved, without explanation, to a small chamber at the far end of the house, and Julian waiting in the corridor with a magistrate's letter in his hand, and an expression of profound rehearsed regret. "There have been questions raised, Duchess, about certain sums missing from the household accounts since you took charge of them, sums that seem to trace rather neatly to your own quarter's allowance, and until the matter is resolved, the Duchess Dowager and I have thought it best that you keep to separate rooms and touch the ledgers no further." She asked where Cassian was. "He is with his mother, and very distressed, as you may imagine, to learn his own wife may have been robbing his house all along, and Lynette, standing in that cold corridor, with the accusations settling over her like a net she had not seen fall, understood that this was the trap's true jaw closing, not on Cassian this time, but on her, aimed to sever the one alliance in the house Julian could not otherwise break. She did not weep, and she did not plead, and she spent that night alone doing sums by candlelight instead, checking and rechecking her own allowance against the missing figures Julian claimed, until she found, well past midnight, that the discrepancy traced not to her hand at all, but to the same hasty, unfamiliar script that had altered the old Duke's dosage 3 years before. Proof now doubled that whoever held that pen was still active in the house's accounts, still forging, still confident that no one clever enough to catch him would ever be believed over him. She was still bent over the ledger when a soft knock came, and Hetty Marsh slipped in with a candle and a folded paper she had kept hidden, she said, in the lining of an old trunk for 3 years, waiting for a reason good enough to risk producing it. This is the physician's true order for his Grace's tonic. The night he died, in his own hand, not the false one Mr. Vane showed the county after. I kept it because I never trusted the smell of that whole business, and because a woman who has buried one master does not intend to bury the truth along with him. Lynette took the paper with hands that were, for the first time in weeks, not entirely steady, and asked Hetty why she had waited so long to bring it forward. Because proof shown too soon, and lost, is proof gone forever, and because I was waiting, Miss Hale, for someone in this house brave enough, or foolish enough, to need it badly enough to use it properly. Lynette looked at the true order in one hand and the false ledger entry in the other, and understood that she was finally holding, between her 2 palms, the entire shape of the lie that had cost this house 3 years of silence, and she thought, with a calm that surprised her, that whatever came next, she intended to bring it into the light before every witness the county could gather, because objects convinced where testimony only argued, and she had, at long last, an object worth producing. They gathered the witnesses over 3 careful days, quietly, the way one lays a fire before striking the match. Lynette sent for the magistrate, a level, unhurried man named Josiah Fairweather, who had known old Duke Edmund and had never much liked Julian Vane's smile, and asked him to attend a full accounting of the household books at Merrifield on the coming Friday, framing it, for Julian's benefit, as nothing more than the ordinary settling of a disputed sum. She sent 2 for Mr. Culpepper, the apothecary, requesting only that he bring his own dispensing records for the old Duke's final months, a request delivered so mildly that Julian, hearing of it, apparently judged it safer to appear cooperative than suspicious. Cassian, released from his mother's rooms once the missing sum accusation collapsed under Lynette's own counterfigures, stood at her shoulder through every hour of the preparation, writing his questions and, more and more often now, speaking short, rough sentences aloud when the writing could not keep pace with his urgency. His voice growing steadier with each use like a limb unbound after long splinting. "You are certain of the hands?" he asked her once, low, watching her lay the 2 ledgers side by side beneath a lamp. "I have never been more certain of anything in a column of figures in my life," she told him, and she meant it, because she had by then matched the hasty forging hand not only in the old dosage entry and the false allowance sum, but in 3 further places across 3 years of accounts, always careful, always nearly perfect, and always, when set beside an undisputed sample of Julian Vane's own steward's correspondence, betrayed by the same small telling curl at the base of every letter S, a habit as unconscious, and as damning as the ring he turned round and round on his smallest finger whenever he believed himself unwatched. Lady Ophelia Grant, who had once been spoken of as the more likely Duchess, and had grown, since the wedding, into something between a rival and a reluctant friend, came to Lynette the night before the reckoning with a confession of her own, admitting with real shame that Julian had asked her, months before, to spread word of the Duke's supposed instability among her acquaintance, and that she had done it, thoughtlessly, believing it kindness rather than poison, until she had watched Lynette refuse a bribe that would have ruined an innocent man to save herself, and had been ashamed enough of her own idle cruelty to want, now, to help undo it. I will stand up and say so before the magistrate myself, if it will serve, Ophelia said, and Lynette, who had expected many things from that quarter but not courage, told her that it would serve very well indeed, and that people were rarely only what their first impression made them, which was, she thought privately, the truest thing she had learned in this whole silent house. By the time Friday came, Julian Vane's composure had begun, for the first time in 3 years of easy smiling, to show its first hairline crack. He arrived at Merrifield's great hall a quarter-hour early, turning his ring, glancing twice toward doors that led outward rather than in, a man who had begun, at last, to smell the smoke before he could see the fire. The hall filled slowly, and then all at once, the way a room does when everyone has been told something is about to happen, without being told what. The magistrate took his chair at the long table with the ledgers before him. Culpepper stood near the window, hat in his hands, sweating faintly though the day was cool. Julian took a chair near the Duchess Dowager and smiled at the assembled staff and tenants with the easy warmth of a man entirely at home in the room, not yet understanding that the room had already been arranged around him like a snare. Cassian stood, and the hall, seeing him rise, went silent in the particular reverent way a crowd goes silent for a man they have been told cannot speak. "It is my wife who has done the work of untangling this house's oldest grief," he said, his voice rough still but carrying. "Every eye upon him, and I will let her lay it before you, because she has earned that, and because I find, after 3 years, that I trust her tongue a good deal more than I ever trusted my own silence." Lynette laid the true physician's order beside the false dosage entry on the table, held both to the lamp so the ink's different ages showed plainly even from the back benches, and read them aloud, her voice steady, the room leaning in as one body to hear. Then she laid Julian's own steward's letters beside the forged entries, letter by letter, the telling curl of every S matching itself across 3 years of documents, and she asked Mr. Culpepper directly, before the magistrate and the assembled house, whose hand had written the increased dosage he had mixed the night the old Duke died. Culpepper's hat turned over and over in his hands. He looked at Julian, and Julian looked back at him with an expression that had gone, in one moment, entirely cold, and it was that coldness, Lynette thought afterward, more than any fear of the magistrate, that finally broke the apothecary, because a man who has been loyal out of terror will forgive almost anything except being looked at as though he were already disposable. "It was Mr. Vane's hand, sir. He brought me the order himself, and told me the physician had sent it late, and had no time to sign it fresh, and he paid me besides to say nothing if ever asked, and God forgive me, I was afraid to refuse him, and I have been more afraid every day since." The hall made a sound like a held breath finally let go. Julian Vane rose halfway from his chair, the ring on his finger turning and turning, and for one moment his composure did not merely crack, but fell away entirely, and what was underneath it was not menace, but something raw and old and almost pitiable. A man who said, in a voice gone suddenly unguarded, that his own father had been the elder brother cheated of this very house by an entail he had. No hand in writing, that he had grown up watching Cassian inherit a birthright that should by every rightful measure have been his own, that he had wanted, God help him, only to be first for once in his life instead of the useful cousin kept always one careful step behind the heir, and that he had never meant for the old Duke to die so soon, only to be weakened enough to lean on him, only to matter at last. Lynette felt something in her chest twist unwillingly toward pity, even as the room around her hardened with judgment, and she understood, watching him, that this was the humanizing grief the moment demanded, envy grown from an old unhealed wrong. Not evil for its own appetite, but evil grown crooked from long deprivation, and that pity for a man like that was not weakness, but the harder, truer thing. It was Cassian who spoke the mercy, and the hall, still ringing with Culpepper's confession, went quiet again to hear it. He is guilty of a crime the law could hang him for, and I will not pretend otherwise before this magistrate, he said, and Josiah Fairweather inclined his head in grave agreement. But I have watched what a public hanging does to the innocent left standing near it. And my mother has carried enough grief for one lifetime, without adding a public execution to the weight of it, and I find, strangely, that I have no wish to make of Julian's ruin a spectacle, when his own envy has already ruined him more thoroughly than any court could manage. He turned to Julian, whose face was wet now, and entirely undefended. You will sign over the stewardship, and you will leave this county before the week is out, and you will have an allowance sufficient to live modestly and honestly somewhere far from here, on the single condition that you never again come within a day's ride of Merrifield or anyone who bears its name. It is not forgiveness. I do not think I have that in me yet, and I will not lie to this room and say I do. It is only that I would rather spend my mercy protecting the people left standing than spend my anger destroying the one already fallen. And I find, now that I have finally said so aloud, that it costs me almost nothing at all to mean it. Julian, weeping in the particular ugly, honest way of a man who has run entirely out of performances, said only that he had not expected kindness, and had not, he thought, deserved to be surprised by it, and Cassian said that surprising the undeserving was, as far as he could tell, the entire point of mercy, and the hall, hearing it, released the breath it had been holding for 3 years along with the one it had been holding all afternoon, and somewhere above the great hall's windows, quite unconcerned with any of it, a linnet went on singing in the aviary his father had built, and he had quietly kept. Because the ordinary world, Linnet thought, watching the light move across the floor while the county's oldest grief, finally, came undone, had never once paused for any of them, and perhaps that was its own kind of mercy too. The weeks that followed unspooled slowly, the way relief always does after a long fright, each fate settling into its place one at a time, like coins counted out onto a table. Julian Vane left the county before the appointed week was out, his allowance modest, his name quietly omitted from the family history the dowager began, with new steadiness in her hands, to keep herself. Culpepper, whose fear the court judged a lesser thing than Julian's greed, was permitted to keep his shop under strict watch and the magistrate's personal unglamorous supervision, and was heard thereafter to give every dosage order twice over out of an abundance of terror, that pleased no one so much as it pleased his customers. Lady Ophelia Grant, having stood up before the whole hall to confess her own thoughtless part in the rumours, found herself, to her own visible surprise, more warmly received by the county afterward than before. And it was Josiah Fairweather, of all steady unlikely men, who began calling on her within the month, drawn, he admitted to Hetty over one of her suppers, by a woman honest enough to publicly own her worst mistake. Hetty Marsh wept unashamedly at the small quiet wedding, blessing Cassian, and Lynette held that autumn to properly mark, before the county, a marriage that had begun as an arrangement, and become, by then, something neither of them any longer thought to call by so cold a word, and she told anyone who would listen, for years afterward, that she had known it from the very first shaking of his shoulders over a tenant's misspelled letter, and that someone really ought to have written it down. The footman's wagering book was finally formally settled the week the whole county learned Cassian Thorne had spoken aloud from a magistrate's floor, and it emerged that not a single wager placed in 3 years had guessed correctly either the date or the cause, which Hetty declared, with great satisfaction, proof that God had a sense of humour about duchesses after all. Cassian saw to it, quietly and without ceremony, that the name of Thomas Hale was entered into the Merrifield stewardship records as an example held up to every clerk who followed him, a steward who had been ruined once for refusing to make a false ledger balance, and was, 3 years too late for him to know it, finally believed. It was nearly a year later, on an ordinary grey morning, much like the one that had begun it all, that Lynette knelt in the passage outside her own parlour to gather a dropped spool of thread, and heard, through the door she had left ajar, her husband's voice, easy now, unguarded, telling their small sleeping daughter a story in the low murmur reserved for children who cannot yet understand thee. Words, only the safety of the sound. She stood and let herself in rather than listening at the door this time, because there was nothing left in that house that needed to be overheard rather than simply shared, and Cassian looked up at her with the grave mouth she had grown to love best of anything, and said, in the voice that had cost him 3 years, and had come, at last, to cost him nothing at all, that she was his, and this time she only crossed the room, and took his hand, and told him that she supposed, all things considered, she would allow it, since he had finally learned to ask properly, and somewhere out past the window a linnet was singing in the aviary his father had built and he had kept. The same ordinary, indifferent, faithful song it had always sung. Through every silence and every reckoning, waiting, as the truest things generally do, for someone patient enough to listen all the way to the end. If this story warmed you, if you have ever loved someone who could not yet find the words and chose to wait for them instead of walking away, then come sit closer to the fire a while longer, because I have more stories like it. And the kettle is already on. Tell me, in the comments below, the moment you knew he wasn't cold at all, only guarding something too heavy to say aloud, because that is always my favourite part to hear back from you. And if you would like to keep a chair kept warm for you here by this hearth, consider staying a while longer and subscribing, so you never miss the next one told. Until then, sleep well, and be gentle with the quiet ones. They are usually only waiting for it to cost them less.